Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here are my two worm bins that have European night crawlers in them. So the abbreviation ENC that you see on both of these tags represents European night crawler. And as you can also see from the dates on these two tags, they both started in the beginning of June with only 1 week difference between them as far as their age goes. And it was only 3 days ago that we fed the younger bin, and today we're going to be feeding the older bin. I'm sorry, reverse that. The older bin is the one that got fed 3 days ago. Today we're feeding the younger bin. The younger bin, if you remember, if you've been watching my channel, is the bin of European night crawlers that came really close to sort of crashing and burning, and we managed to salvage the environment and create a new space for them to move into. We even had to help move some of them over into that new space. And then we ended up hauling out the material that was suspect and kind of crashing, turning anaerobic. And it's just because of that I've been keeping the tag on there as sort of a reminder that, hey, this was a pretty close call, and let's be really careful not to have that happen again. But I guess what you also see is some remnants of the slime and the filth and the gross material that had been in here was really getting kind of muddy and sticky and gooey, and I figured maybe just leaving it smeared on the side of the walls of the container would also serve as a little bit of a reminder for myself to, that I've got to be really careful to not let that sort of thing happen again. So I'm going to be getting this bin out onto the bench because it is due for a feeding, because it's been 8 days since we last fed it. Or has it been 9? Yeah, it was actually 9. So let's get this thing up on the bench and see how things stand after that much time. I've got a feeling it's going to need some food. So now just to elaborate a little bit on what I said earlier, the whole thing about not wanting to let that happen again and the bin going quote-unquote anaerobic, as I mentioned earlier, that's just really an expression that says that the airflow within the material had been stifled to the point where certain types of bacteria that thrive in low oxygen environments were able to sort of get a foothold and kind of go berserk and really leave the material oxygen free. And since worms need to breathe through their skin, through the moisture that they come in contact with in their environment, if that moisture is depleted of oxygen, the poor worms will suffocate. They'll just be unable to breathe and they'll perish. So that's pretty much my conclusion as far as what happened, or almost happened, in this bin. I mean, it did definitely affect a good number of worms, but I believe we did manage to save a good number of them as well. So the bin, last time it was fed, received foods that I suspect are not going to be leaving any leftovers, because there was stuff like watermelon rinds, there was, I think, cucumber, there was something else. I did look over the video from last time, and it was all stuff that you would expect to see gobbled up pretty quickly by worms in about a week's time. Some people on their channels refer to that as their fast food, and those are just the easy things for them to eat, stuff that's pretty easy to gobble up. And then there's those other things in the worm bin that would sort of classify as those slow breakdown foods, such as this little chunk of corn cob here. Corn cob is definitely a slow breakdown item. And besides the corn cob, I remember there were a couple other types of leftovers in this bin that I would also consider as sort of slow breakdown items. There were a number of avocados in here. One of them was placed in here whole, and the other one was placed in here, I think, a week later, or in the subsequent feeding, as 2 halves of an avocado. And even though the fleshy part, the inside of the avocado, might be easy for the worms to eat, this tough shell of the outside might be something that takes them a little bit longer to consume. So I could see a worm hanging out here on the outside of it, and as I try to peer down into the holes that I created on the skin for them to gain access to the inside, I could see worms on the inside as well. So this is the whole avocado that I made reference to earlier, but there were 2 halves as well. And I guess since those were, cut open, There you go. The fleshy part of the avocado is much easier for the worms to gain access to this way. So it's not really surprising that we've got a whole bunch of worms in here taking advantage of it. But you know, last week this was already registering as a leftover, and that means it was placed in here. And I keep saying last week, but it's last feeding, you know, because if, you know, the last feeding was 9 days ago, that was definitely more than a week. And I believe that the feeding even prior to that was even longer than a week, maybe almost 2 weeks. So it's just a little surprising to me to see this much leftover avocado. Because I always thought that avocado was one of those things that the worms really get jazzed about and go nuts about and pig out on. Because then all of a sudden you come up against a piece of corn cob that the worms really do seem to be enjoying, and they're just mobbed inside of the inside of it. It does seem to me like the inside of the corn cob is the part that they're able to consume much more rapidly, and then over time they could work down the outer portions of the corn cob. So a little surprising to see them kind of mobbing the corn cob rather than the avocado, but who knows. Then I think that this was the last sort of slow composting item that I recall being in here, which was the seed out of a mango. You know, if you ever handle one of these things, it's a really tough husk. And when you look inside this husk, that's really where the seed is, I believe. I don't think that this husk really registers as the seed itself. It's just sort of the protective enclosure for the seed. And I think we had a couple of those in here too. So, you know, these things all sitting in here week after week, sitting in here for quite some time is perfectly normal. And they'll work their way through that stuff over time, but I always like to try to provide them with some other things that, you know, give them access to quick, easy to eat foods. Because some of those things just might not be entirely ready to be eaten. There might be parts of it that have already gotten infiltrated by the bacteria and the microbes and everything within the bin, enabling the worms to start slurping that stuff up as food, but some of it might still not have reached that stage of decomposition where the worms can really begin taking advantage of it as food yet. So until that happens, I want to just provide them with what they need as far as nourishment goes. And then over time, they'll be able to eat up these things as well. Even the shells, everything will go over time. So I definitely enjoy providing my worm bins with kind of a variety of both slow and fast foods, if you will. And then the rest of the stuff you see down here, bits of cardboard like these tubes of toilet paper tubes, all kinds of scraps of leaves, shreds of newspaper. I've been going kind of crazy on applying lots and lots of bedding to all my worm bins lately, and this one's no exception. And we'll do the same here as well today. We'll definitely be generous on the bedding. But I guess what I was doing here while I was speaking was I was actually trying to see if I can find any remnants of the last feeding, which, like I said earlier, was definitely a few chunks of watermelon rind. And I guess maybe that's just a futile effort to go looking for a piece of that in a worm bin, because that's going to go quick. Cucumbers too, those are going to be gone quick as well. So to go on a crazy goose chase looking for that sort of stuff is kind of a waste of time, because chances are there's really going to be no sign of it in here. Unless it got jammed in between some stuff and just was inaccessible to the worms, but they seem to find that stuff pretty easily and rip it to shreds. 1, 2, 3. So this is the big hole that I've created down here to add today's feeding to, and I'm going to kind of follow suit with what I've been doing lately, which is to use some of these leaves that have been in here now for a while, since the last feeding at least, because these leaves that we're seeing on the outer surface are ones that I would have scattered in as sort of fresh new top covering to cover up the entire bin with some nice fresh leaves. But now that they've been in the bin for a little while, I think that they're suitable to go into the feeding area as the bedding to accompany their food. So we'll just throw these bits of leftover food scraps in here too. Maybe a little bit more of this recycled leafy matter, because I've got a whole box of leafy matter that we can replace the top covering stuff with, in case we use up a great deal of it down in the feeding area. And As far as their food goes today, I didn't bring anything down yet, so I will have to take a pause here momentarily to run upstairs really quick and tap into my supply of worm foods up in my freezer to feed them. And I believe that's a good segue into taking that break right now, because we're almost ready now to place their food in here. I might use some other types of bedding here in addition to the fresh leafy matter we're going to drop in on top. I've got some shredded paper and whatnot. But we'll pick up where we left off once I get back from the freezer. So break time, I will return with some food. So the assortment of foods that I selected for them is not very different from what you normally see me picking out of my freezer. It's just a variety of this and that. A lot of it's pretty easy to identify. The rinds of some cantaloupe melons, a large slice of a piece of carrot, as well as a little baby carrot over here, some lettuce leaves. I think there was even the butt end of a head of lettuce down at the bottom over here. Looks like there's even a little scrap of newspaper in here. When I got all these chunks of spoiled cucumber from my mom, she had wrapped them up in some newspaper, and the newspaper sort of stuck to the cucumber. And obviously what you see here is just some used coffee, including its coffee filter, and over here too some other used paper, a napkin and a paper towel. Pretty good size feeding. Besides the feeding, you know, they're going to get some grit to help with the digestion of those foods. And like I said earlier, I'm going to bring in my collection of shredded paper here, because lately I've been doing my best to try to include a lot of carbon-based food to go hand in hand with their feedings. And, you know, even before this stuff becomes sort of a food source for them, as far as like a carbon-rich food source, a lot of people would actually consider that as bedding material. And to me, it's almost synonymous. I'm never even quite sure how to refer to it. Perhaps here, the way it's sort of thrown in here in pretty good amounts, you might want to consider it as sort of a bedding type material. But, you know, when a worm encounters just a piece of fairly well-aged paper and it starts nibbling on it, at that point it's just a carbon food source. So it does serve both functions, basically. So let's see, I got all kinds of good stuff here, and I guess you can probably imagine that these food items are also going to be the types of things that the worms are going to be able to do away with pretty quickly. But then again, sometimes it's a little surprising, you know, to think that a corn cob would take a long time, because it just seems like the sort of sweet thing that worms would just nibble right away. But for whatever reason, I think it just might be a bit resistant to decomposition, and maybe that's the reason it sits around in the worm bin so long before the worms can finally tap into it as a food source. Or at least parts of it are somewhat resistant. So it's a pretty nice little feeding for them, right? And before I drop in the coffee, I guess I'll sprinkle in a little bit of the crushed eggshell here, which is the form of grit that I use in my bins. I'm pretty generous with the grit. I pretty much include it in almost every feeding, so if I were to run out or whatever the case may be, I wouldn't have to feel like I've got to circle back and take care of it and add it, because it's so critical. It's the sort of thing that's pretty abundant in all of my bins, I believe, because I do add it pretty regularly. Here, once again, this is just paper. Pretty low nitrogen content, or pretty much no nitrogen content, I guess, in a piece of paper. It's pretty much carbon food as far as I'm concerned. But all this other stuff, especially the coffee, all these veggie and fruit scraps, those are all the nitrogen-rich food items that the feeding is consisting of here. So that's pretty much the feeding, but, you know, stuff like melon, all these yummy, delicious things, I don't want to have those things out on the surface, you know, because then the bin might start attracting pests, and I don't want to have that happen. I'm actually in the basement of my house, so I do get a little paranoid about my worm bins possibly becoming the center of attention for some sort of weird pests, whatever they may be. So I do my best to try to make sure the feedings I apply to my bins are pretty much submerged below the surface in most cases, if possible. I mean, certain things like the coffee I don't think would attract pests, but other things like that, you know, watermelon rind would definitely attract certain things to it. So before we close up here, I always like to take a little peek on the outer edge. So now 62 days is the age of this bin. So that would pretty much equate it to about 2 months of age. And I believe it might be its 5th feeding, or maybe its 6th. So it's a pretty nice looking bin if you gauge it from the appearance of the material out here. I mean, it is pretty much littered with little scraps of cardboard and paper and bits of leaves, but you can also see that it's mixed pretty thoroughly with a whole bunch of worm castings already as well. The moisture level's not bad out here. It's got a good dampness to it. I'm going to see if I can mix in a little bit of leafy matter here, which is something I've been doing lately, is just trying to make sure that these outer edges of the bin that don't get fed at least get a little bit of attention each go around, each check-in, just to make sure I'm kind of fluffing it up, inspecting it, combining some fresh bedding in with what's there already, and also at the same time making sure that the dampness level is pretty good still. I think in one of my bins, it might have been yesterday, I found that the outskirts of the bins were feeling a little bit dry, so I did actually sort of do a more major stirring up of the materials to bring a lot of that dry stuff inboard, closer to where the foods were being applied, so that they can benefit from some of the moisture that gets kicked off from the food that's thawing out and breaking down. But here I don't think it's going to be necessary. I think the moisture level throughout this bin is almost perfect everywhere you look. So here too, I'm just going to throw in a little bit more of this leafy matter and combine it with what's there already. And this way I feel like my bin pretty much throughout has a good high concentration of bedding materials everywhere, keeping the whole consistency of everything nice and loose and flaky. Nothing muddy or clumpy or sticky like what had been in here before when the bin was crashing. That's pretty much been my paranoia lately, is to not let that happen to any of my worm bins anymore. So everything looks really nice in here, I've got to say. I don't think we saw any major concentrations of worms, but you have to admit there were worms pretty much everywhere, no matter where we looked. So it's a pretty capable bin when it comes to breaking stuff down, even taking into account the fact that the near catastrophic situation that occurred in here a couple months ago, and was narrowly averted, probably did take down a good number of the worms that occupied this bin, but I think I nipped it in the bud and I stopped it before it could become a major situation. So this is just the way I like to leave my bins. It is all dry material, but usually by the time I come back into the bin, even though it is a little bit drier than everything else down within the lower reaches of the bin, the material does eventually start to pick up a little bit of the moisture from the materials that are below it. And I guess it's probably also a good compensation to the dampness that's held within all the food items that I've just added too. So it seems like it's been a pretty good combination. Putting in the frozen foods that I know we're going to thaw and kick off moisture, combined with some freshly added dry bedding materials, for me at least, has been doing a pretty good job keeping the moisture levels just about right in all my bins. So, all right, that's it for today's feeding. I've been thinking, you know, since it was only 3 days ago since we fed my other European Nightcrawler bin, and since there's only a week of difference between their ages, I have been thinking about maybe letting both bins go a little bit longer, let them starve a little bit, really get them psyched up for a fresh feeding, and then maybe feed them both at the same time and kind of get them onto the same schedule. Because then maybe if we're feeding them at the same time within the same video, we can kind of compare and contrast them and use them as a sort of a, you know, a measure against one another to see how they're doing. You know, perhaps if one of them starts to look a little odd, then we could use the other as sort of a, you know, something to a point of comparison or something like that. So just some food for thought. I don't know, maybe the next time we see this bin, it might be getting fed with the other European Nightcrawler bin that I've got, and we'll just take care of them both at the same time, since they are pretty much close in age and pretty close on the feeding schedule anyway. So, all right, well, that's just some food for thought for me. We'll see how I decide later. But I got a little bit more stuff to do here as far as putting things away and cleaning things up, but I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm going to sign off now, but before I do, let me just say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.